The twilight bled purple and bruised grey over the city of Viridia, staining the ancient stones of the royal citadel with the melancholy of another ending day. For 800 years, Dimitri had watched this same sun die, and for 800 years, he had felt nothing. He stood on the highest parapet of his castle, a ghost in his own life, the king of a kingdom he ruled by rote. The wind, sharp with the promise of a cold night, tore at the black velvet of his coat, but he did not feel it. Cold was his natural state, an internal permafrost that had set in centuries ago, leaving him a perfect, frozen monument to a grief he no longer remembered the shape of. His eyes, the color of winter moonlight on polished silver, swept over the sprawling city below, seeing everything and perceiving nothing. The concerns of the mortals who scurried through the streets below were as distant to him as the stars beginning to prick the deepening sky. Their lives were fleeting sparks in his endless, unchanging night. He was a creature of stasis, a king of dust and memory. He turned to descend the tower stairs, the silence of his movements a testament to his nature. The castle was always silent, its vast halls echoing with the absence of life. His courtiers, ancient and bloodbound like himself, were quiet things, moving through the shadows with the same weary dispassion he embodied. They had learned long ago that their king desired nothing, which meant they, in turn, had nothing to offer. And so, the kingdom of Viridia existed, but it did not live. It simply was. Like him. As he reached the bottom of the grand staircase, a sound broke the hallowed quiet. A tiny, sniffling sob. It was a sound so profoundly out of place in the sterile stillness of his home that it was like a shard of glass in a bowl of milk. Dimitri paused, his head tilting with an almost imperceptible slowness. His silver eyes scanned the cavernous entrance hall, lit by cold, ethereal light that filtered through towering stained-glass windows depicting forgotten victories. There, a small pool of color and life against the monolithic gray of a pillar, stood a child. She was impossibly small, no more than 6 years of age, with a tangle of dark hair and a smudged face wet with tears. She wore a simple, patched dress, the fabric worn thin with use. But it was what she clutched to her chest that held his gaze. A stuffed rabbit, its button eyes askew, one ear floppier than the other, loved to the point of disintegration. The sight was so incongruous, so deeply mortal and fragile, that for the first time in centuries, Dimitri felt a flicker of something other than profound emptiness. It was not an emotion, not yet, but the barest electrical twitch in a dead nerve. He did not move. He simply watched as the child took a hiccuping breath, her little shoulders shaking. She seemed to be gathering a courage that a creature her size had no right to possess. Then, her wide, brown eyes, glistening with unshed tears, found his. She took a step forward, then another, her worn leather shoes making no sound on the polished marble. She stopped a few feet from him, a tiny, determined island in an ocean of stone and shadow. "Are you the king?" she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. Dimitri did not answer immediately. The act of speech felt foreign, a rusty mechanism he rarely engaged for such trivial matters. He was used to issuing commands, not answering the questions of lost children. He gave a single, curt nod. The child took another deep, shuddering breath. She held the stuffed rabbit out slightly, as if for protection, or perhaps as an offering. "My name is Lily," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And my mama is gone." The words hung in the cold air. My mama is gone. Simple. Devastating. The kind of raw, uncomplicated tragedy that defined the mortal world. It should have meant nothing to him. He had seen empires fall, bloodlines wither, civilizations turn to dust. The loss of one woman in a city of thousands was less than a rounding error in the grand, brutal mathematics of his existence. He should have turned away. He should have signaled for a guard to remove the child, to return her to the squalor from which she had clearly wandered. It was the logical, efficient, and kingly thing to do. But he did not move. His silver eyes remained fixed on the small, tear-streaked face. He saw the desperate hope warring with terror in her eyes. He saw the way her small hands whitened as she clutched her rabbit, her only anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. And that dead nerve twitched again, harder this time. It was an unfamiliar sensation, a faint, phantom ache in the hollow cavity of his chest where a heart had once beaten. It was the echo of a memory, a feeling so ancient it had no name. The memory of wanting to protect something small and breakable. "Please," Lily whispered, and the single word was her last reserve of strength. A final tear broke free and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "The bad men took her. Can you find her?" An absurd request. A king did not find people. He ruled. He commanded. He endured. But looking at this child, Dimitri understood that to her, a king was not a symbol of power or a political entity. A king was the person you went to when the world fell apart. A king was supposed to fix things. It was a child's logic, pure and uncorrupted by the realities of governance and indifference. And for some reason he could not fathom, he felt the immense, suffocating weight of that simple expectation. To refuse would be easy. It would be what he had done for 800 years. He would return to the silence, to the cold, to the comfortable and familiar numbness. But the image of the stuffed rabbit, the sound of that single, desperate pleas, had done something irreversible. It had introduced a variable into his stagnant equation. A small, warm, living thing had breached the walls of his frozen world, and he found he could not simply cast it back out into the cold. With a slowness that felt like shifting continents, Dimitri knelt. It was a movement he had not made for anyone in centuries, an act of deference that felt utterly alien to his rigid posture. He brought himself down to her level, the black velvet of his coat pooling on the marble floor. His silver eyes, now inches from hers, were no longer the distant, cold orbs of a monarch, but something more focused, more present. He reached out a hand, his long, pale fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently touched the tattered ear of the stuffed rabbit. The worn fabric was soft beneath his cold skin. He felt the child's small flinch, the sharp intake of her breath, but she did not pull away. His gaze lifted from the toy to her face. "Show me where," he said. The words were gravelly from disuse, but they were a promise. A crack had appeared in the ice. Lily's small hand, trembling but resolute, slipped into his. It was shockingly warm, a tiny coal against the perpetual winter of his skin. The contact was a jolt, a current of life that traveled up his arm and settled in his chest, right beside that strange, new ache. He did not let go. He rose to his full, imposing height, the child's hand held securely in his own. For the first time in longer than any mortal could comprehend, King Dimitri had a purpose beyond merely existing. He was going to find a woman he had never met, for a child who had done the impossible. She had asked him for help, and he had heard her. Without a word to his stunned courtiers, who melted back into the shadows from which they had been observing, the ancient king and the small girl walked out of the silent castle and into the encroaching night, a single, shared point of warmth between them. The place Lily led him to was a part of his own city he had not set foot in for half a millennium. He called it the Undercroft, its miserable inhabitants called it the Narrows. It was a festering labyrinth of cobbled alleys slick with refuse and despair, where the towering, opulent architecture of Viridia's upper city pressed down, casting the streets into perpetual twilight. The air was thick and wet, heavy with the stench of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and the cloying sweetness of rot. Here, the disenfranchised, the forgotten, and the predatory dwelled in a symbiotic misery. It was the dark, neglected underbelly of his kingdom, a place his governance had failed so profoundly that he had simply chosen to forget it existed. Lily's presence here was a stark, physical rebuke. She did not speak, merely pointed with her free hand, her small body pressed tightly against his leg as they moved deeper into the warren. Her warmth was a strange comfort against the damp chill that seeped from the very stones. The denizens of the Narrows melted away before them. They saw the severe, aristocratic lines of his face, the unnatural stillness of his bearing, the silver eyes that seemed to absorb the meager light and reflect none of it back. They saw a predator far older and more dangerous than any they knew, and they scurried into darkened doorways and deeper shadows, their whispers following him like the rustle of rats in the walls. Dimitri paid them no mind. His focus was singular, narrowed to the grim task at hand, a task given to him by the small, trusting hand in his. They stopped before a dilapidated tenement, its windows boarded over, a faint, guttering light visible through the cracks. A low, guttural laugh echoed from within, followed by a woman's sharp, defiant cry. Lily flinched, her grip on his hand tightening until her knuckles were white. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. "Mama," she breathed, the word a fragile prayer. Dimitri's expression did not change, but a cold, precise anger began to coalesce within him. It was not the hot, passionate rage of a mortal man. It was something far more ancient and terrible, the detached, efficient fury of a force of nature. He gently squeezed Lily's hand. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice a low murmur that was somehow more menacing than a shout. He released her and she scrambled behind the relative safety of a stack of rotting crates, clutching her rabbit so tightly it was a wonder the seams did not burst. He did not knock. He did not need to. He placed a hand flat against the splintered wood of the door and pushed. The wood did not splinter or crack, it simply disintegrated into a cloud of dust and rotten fibers as the doorframe ripped from the wall. The sound of it crashing inward was a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet of the alley. For a moment, the scene within was frozen in a tableau of greasy torchlight. 3 men, hulking and filthy, their faces a roadmap of cheap liquor and casual brutality. And in the corner, a woman. She was on her knees but not cowed. Her hands were bound behind her back, a smudge of dirt marred one high cheekbone, but her head was held high. A cascade of dark hair, the same shade as Lily's, was matted with sweat, but it couldn't dim the ferocious light in her eyes. They were the color of new leaves in spring, a startling, vibrant green that seemed to defy the squalor surrounding her. She was staring at her captors with a look of such concentrated, unadulterated loathing that it was a weapon in itself. This was Rose. Lily's mother. A healer, the child had whispered on their journey. He could see it now, the strength in her hands, even bound, the fierce, protective energy that radiated from her like heat. The 3 men turned, their shock curdling into aggression as they took in the sight of Dimitri standing in the ruined doorway. He was a specter of aristocratic disdain, his black coat unstained by the filth of his surroundings, his silver eyes promising a swift and merciless end. "Who the hell are you?" the largest of them snarled, grabbing a rusty short sword from a nearby table. Dimitri did not grace him with an answer. He moved. It was not a run or a charge, it was simply a transition from one point in space to another. One moment he was in the doorway, the next he was beside the man with the sword. The man's eyes widened, a grunt of surprise his only epitaph. Dimitri's hand shot out, not in a punch, but with his fingers extended and rigid. They struck the man's throat with the force and finality of a blacksmith's hammer striking hot iron. There was a sickening, wet crack, and the man crumpled to the floor, his sword clattering on the flagstones. It had taken less than a second. The other 2 stared, their booze-addled brains struggling to process the impossible speed, the casual, brutal finality of the act. One of them, his face a mask of panic, made a fatal error. He lunged not at Dimitri, but toward Rose, grabbing a fistful of her hair and pulling a grimy knife to her throat. "Don't move," he shrieked, his voice cracking with fear. Rose did not cry out. She met Dimitri's gaze over the man's shoulder, and in her green eyes, he saw not fear for herself, but a flicker of concern for him, for the child she did not know was just outside. It was this, more than the man's pathetic threat, that sealed his fate. The cold, precise anger within Dimitri sharpened to a razor's edge. He took a single, deliberate step forward. "Release her," he said, his voice dropping to a near-subsonic calm that was more terrifying than any threat. "I'll kill her. I swear I will," the man babbled, pressing the blade harder against her skin. A thin line of red appeared on her throat. Dimitri's eyes narrowed. The world seemed to slow, the sputtering torchlight elongating, the frantic breathing of the men becoming a drawn-out, pathetic wheeze. He saw the tremor in the hand holding the knife, the bead of sweat tracing a path down the man's temple, the defiant pulse beating in Rose's throat, just millimeters from the blade. In that stretched-out moment, he made a calculation. The man was terrified, his movements clumsy. He was also right-hand. His partner, the 3rd rogue, was fumbling for a weapon to his left. The geometry of the room, the vectors of threat, the pathetic, predictable patterns of frightened men, it was all a simple, solvable problem. He moved again. A blur of black velvet and cold purpose. He was not there, and then he was. The man holding Rose grunted, his eyes going wide with confusion as his knife hand was suddenly empty. He looked down to see Dimitri's fingers wrapped around his wrist, the bones grinding together with an audible crunch. He screamed, a high, thin sound that was cut short as Dimitri's other hand closed over his face, thumb and forefinger pressing into the soft tissue beneath his jaw. A sharp twist, a sound like snapping dry twigs, and the second man fell, his limbs tangling with the first. The third man, who had just managed to draw a crude cudgel, simply dropped it. He stared at his two dead companions, then at the silent, silver-eyed figure standing over them, and he broke. He turned to flee, scrambling for the back of the hovel. He didn't get 2 steps. Dimitri was behind him, a hand landing softly on his shoulder. The man froze, every muscle in his body locking in sheer terror. "You will tell me why you took her," Dimitri said, his voice a quiet rustle of dead leaves in the man's ear. "And you will tell me who sent you. Then, I will decide if you live to see the dawn." The man's confession was a pathetic, blubbering torrent of words. They were hired muscle, paid by a slumlord named Silas to abduct the healer. She had been treating the sick in the Narrows for free, costing him a small fortune in the quack remedies he sold to the desperate. He wanted to make an example of her. It was a story of petty greed and casual cruelty, the kind of sordid tale that played out 1,000 times a day in the forgotten corners of his kingdom. When the man was finished, Dimitri considered him for a long, silent moment. Then he released him. "Go," he said. "Tell Silas I will be coming for him. Tell him the king remembers the Narrows." The man didn't need to be told twice. He fled into the night, his panicked footsteps echoing down the alley. Dimitri turned back to Rose. She was still on the floor, watching him with a mixture of awe, terror, and something else he couldn't quite name. Her green eyes were wide, taking in the carnage, the brutal, inhuman efficiency with which he had dispatched her captors. He moved to her side, producing a small, sharp blade from within his coat and slicing through the ropes binding her wrists with a single, fluid motion. She rubbed her chafed skin, her gaze never leaving his face. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. There was no fawning gratitude, no hysterics. Just a simple, direct statement of fact. She was, he realized, utterly unafraid of him. Wary, perhaps, but not afraid. It was refreshing. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement. He offered her a hand to help her up. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. Her hand was calloused and capable, her grip firm. As he pulled her to her feet, the ruin of the doorway was filled with a small, frantic shape. "Mama!" Lily launched herself across the room, colliding with Rose's legs and burying her face in the fabric of her skirt, her small body racked with relieved sobs. Rose's composure finally broke. She sank back to her knees, wrapping her arms around her daughter, her own tears mingling with Lily's. She rocked her back and forth, murmuring words of comfort, her fierce green eyes closed in a prayer of thanks. Dimitri stood back, an observer of a scene of love so potent it seemed to warm the very air in the squalid room. He watched as Rose held her child, her fierce protector's spirit melting into a mother's boundless tenderness. He was the architect of this reunion, the instrument of their salvation, yet he felt profoundly separate from it, a creature of shadow standing on the edge of a circle of light. But as he watched Rose kiss the top of Lily's head, she looked up, her green eyes finding his over her daughter's tangled hair. And in them, he saw not just gratitude, but a flicker of understanding. A recognition. As if she saw past the monster who had just killed 2 men without a flicker of emotion, and glimpsed the one who had knelt to a crying child. The journey back to the citadel was a study in contrasts. Lily, exhausted but ecstatic, was now asleep in her mother's arms. Rose walked beside Dimitri, her steps sure and even, her gaze sweeping over the grand, moon-washed architecture of the upper city with a critical, appraising eye. She had said little since her rescue, her attention focused entirely on her daughter. Dimitri, for his part, found himself in the unprecedented position of escorting 2 mortal females through the silent, echoing halls of a palace that had not known the sound of a child's breathing for centuries. He led them to a suite of rooms in the East Wing, a place of dormant luxury with tapestries thick with dust and furniture shrouded in white linen ghosts. It overlooked a garden that had long ago gone wild. He had chosen it for its isolation, a place where they would not be disturbed by the few remaining members of his moribund court. "You will be safe here," he stated, the words falling with the finality of a royal decree. He gestured to the rooms. "There is food, water, a place to rest." Rose laid the sleeping Lily gently on a vast, canopied bed, pulling a thick velvet coverlet over her small form. She straightened up and turned to face him, her arms crossed over her chest. The fire had returned to her green eyes, banked but still burning brightly. "For how long?" she asked, her voice quiet but unyielding. Dimitri blinked. It was not the question he had expected. "Until you are recovered. Until the threat in the Narrows is dealt with. And then we are free to go." The question hung in the air between them, sharp and pointed. He had saved her life, brought her to a place of safety and luxury beyond the dreams of most in his city, and her first concern was the terms of her release. He found he was not offended. He was intrigued. He had grown so accustomed to unquestioning obedience or terrified supplication that her directness was like a splash of cold, clean water. "You are not my prisoners," he said, his voice level. Rose's gaze did not waver. "Are we your guests, then? Or your projects?" A sudden fit of royal conscience. The words were a direct hit, striking at the very heart of his own confusion. He did not know what they were to him. He had acted on an impulse he still did not understand, a forgotten instinct dredged up by a child's tears. He had no plan, no endgame. He had simply responded. For a man who had not made an unplanned move in 500 years, the sensation was deeply unsettling. "You are under my protection," he settled on, the words feeling inadequate and hollow. She gave a small, humorless smile. "I've seen your protection, Your Majesty. It is terrifyingly effective. Forgive me if I wonder about its cost." She glanced at her own throat in a nearby gilded mirror, at the thin red line left by the rogue's knife. Then her gaze shifted to her hands, the healer's hands, which she began to examine with a professional detachment. He had seen her tending to her own chafed wrists in the hovel, a small act of self-sufficiency that had struck him as deeply characteristic. She was not a damsel to be rescued, she was a survivor who had been temporarily overwhelmed. "There is no cost," he said, and was surprised to find that he meant it. Her eyes met his again, searching, weighing. "Everyone in this city knows the king does not involve himself in the lives of his people. Not anymore. Yet you came for me, for a child you'd never met. Why?" He had no answer for her. Because her daughter clutched a stuffed rabbit. Because for a fleeting moment, he had felt something akin to responsibility. Because he was bored. None of those felt true, and yet all of them were part of the fractured, incomprehensible whole. Your daughter was persuasive, was all he could offer. She seemed to accept this, for now. A flicker of softness crossed her face as she looked back at the sleeping form of her child. "Lily has a way of getting past people's walls," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She turned back, her expression once again serious. "I am a healer. My people in the Narrows need me. I cannot stay here long." "The man who hired your abductors will be dealt with by morning," Dimitri assured her. "The Narrows will be safer for you when you return." It was a vow. She nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of his power. "Thank you, Your Majesty. For my daughter's sake, and for my own." The formality was back, a shield raised between them. He was the king, she was his subject. The brief, raw honesty of the moment had passed. He gave a slight, formal bow of his head and turned to leave, the heavy oak door closing with a soft click behind him, sealing them in their gilded cage. As he walked back through the silent, cavernous corridors of his castle, the echo of Rose's questions followed him. Why? He had ruled for centuries without ever needing to question his own motives, for he had none. He simply was. But now, two mortals, one fierce and challenging, the other small and trusting, had taken up residence not only in his home, but in his thoughts. The silence of the castle suddenly felt different. It was no longer a comfortable, familiar emptiness. It felt lonely. And for the first time, he was aware of the profound, crushing weight of all the years he had spent alone in the cold. The days that followed fell into a strange and unfamiliar rhythm. Dimitri kept his promise. The slumlord Silas was removed. A swift and silent affair that sent a tremor of fear and speculation through the city's underbelly. Word spread like wildfire. The king had acted. For the first time in living memory, the shadow of the citadel had fallen upon the Narrows, not with indifference, but with a terrifying, decisive purpose. For Rose and Lily, however, the castle became a temporary world unto itself. Rose, true to her nature, was not idle. Once she was satisfied that Lily was safe and recovering from her ordeal, she began to explore her gilded prison. Dimitri would see her in the wild, overgrown gardens, her healer's hands gently tending to neglected rose bushes, her brow furrowed in concentration as she identified herbs that had long since choked out the ornamental flowers. She moved with a quiet purpose that was a stark contrast to the aimless drifting of his own courtiers. She was a living thing in a museum of the undead. Lily, on the other hand, was a force of pure, unadulterated life. Once her initial awe of the castle wore off, she treated its vast, intimidating spaces as her personal playground. Her small footsteps became a familiar patter in the echoing halls, a sound that began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a heartbeat. She was utterly without fear of him. She would find him in the library, where he spent most of his days surrounded by the silent, leather-bound thoughts of dead men, and pepper him with questions. "Why are your eyes sad?" she asked one afternoon, peering up at him from the floor where she was attempting to teach her stuffed rabbit, whom she had named Sir Reginald, how to read a medieval bestiary. Dimitri looked up from a crumbling scroll, the question catching him off guard. "My eyes are not sad," he stated, a simple denial of fact. "Yes, they are," Lily insisted with the unshakable certainty of a 6-year-old. "They look like the sky before it rains." All grey and quiet, she tilted her head. "Do you ever laugh?" He stared at her, the question so alien he had to process it intellectually. Laughter. He vaguely recalled the sensation, a muscular contraction in the chest, a sound. He could not remember the last time he had produced it himself. "No," he said. "Why not?" "I have no reason to." Lily seemed to consider this a great tragedy. She scrambled to her feet, clutching Sir Reginald, and stood beside his enormous, carved oak chair. "My mama says laughing is like sunshine for your insides. Maybe you just need more sunshine." She patted his hand, her small, warm fingers a stark contrast to his own cold, still ones. "It's okay." Sir Reginald doesn't laugh either. He's very serious. These encounters left him feeling strangely off balance, as if the very foundations of his being were being subtly, persistently eroded by a child's relentless curiosity. She did not see a fearsome monarch or an ancient predator. She saw a tall, quiet man with sad eyes who needed more sunshine. She saw him not for what he was, but for what he might be, and the sheer, innocent force of her perception was a thing he had no defense against. His interactions with Rose were of a different nature entirely. They were infrequent at first, polite encounters in hallways or brief conversations about supplies she needed. But one evening, she sought him out in the library. He was standing before the fire, its flames the only source of warmth and movement in the cavernous room, when she entered without knocking. "The Narrows are quiet," she said, her voice pulling him from a reverie he hadn't realized he was in. "The people are frightened, but they're also hopeful. They say the king has woken up." "Fear is a more effective tool for order than hope," he replied, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Is that what this is about? Order?" She walked further into the room, stopping a few feet away from him. The firelight caught the green of her eyes, making them glow. "You could have instilled order with a dozen guards and a proclamation. You came yourself. You killed those men with your own hands. That wasn't about order. That was personal." He turned to face her, his silver eyes meeting hers. "They threatened a child who had come to me for aid. They laid hands on one of my subjects. It was a matter of principle." Rose's expression was skeptical. "You have thousands of subjects in the Narrows whose suffering you have ignored for centuries. My suffering was no different. What principle changed?" He had no answer, and his silence was a confession. She took another step closer, her voice softening slightly. "I'm not ungrateful, Dimitri." It was the first time she had used his name, and the sound of it on her tongue was strangely intimate. I am trying to understand. You live in this magnificent tomb, surrounded by ghosts, ruling a kingdom you seem to have no interest in. And then one day, you walk into the worst part of your city to save a woman and child you've never met. A man like you doesn't do that without a reason. Perhaps my reasons are my own, he said, his tone cooler than he intended. He was not accustomed to being analyzed, to having his actions questioned and his motives dissected. Perhaps, she conceded. But your actions affect more than just yourself. Your dealing with Silas left a power vacuum. The other predators are circling. The people are more vulnerable than before. You ripped out a weed, but you didn't tend the garden. Now, worse things are starting to grow in its place. Her words were a quiet indictment, and they struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was right. He had acted, but he had not thought through the consequences. He had treated the Narrows as a problem to be solved with a single, violent act, not as a community of living people with complex problems. He had been a king in title, but not in practice. He had forgotten the most fundamental duty of his station, to care for his people. All of them. He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the compassionate strength that radiated from her. She was not just a healer of bodies, she was a tender of communities. She saw the intricate web of lives he had long been blind to. What would you have me do? He asked, and the question was not a king demanding counsel, but a man admitting his own failure. It was the most vulnerable thing he had said in 800 years. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by a determined resolve. Come with me, she said. Don't send your guards. Don't issue a decree from on high. Come down from this cold mountain and see the people you've forgotten. See what they need. Help me heal not just their wounds, but the sickness in the heart of this city. The sickness of your neglect. It was a challenge. A command, almost. And as he looked into her vibrant, unyielding green eyes, he felt that old, frozen part of him shift again. It was not a crack this time. It was the slow, groaning, terrifying sound of a glacier beginning to move. He had been stagnant for centuries, a king ruling over a kingdom of ghosts, chief among them himself. And now, this mortal woman, with her healer's hands and her warrior's heart, was offering him a reason to move again. A reason to live. When do we start? He heard himself say. The decision to return to the Narrows with Rose was, in itself, a revolution. Not of the kingdom, but of the self. For Dimitri, descending from the citadel was more than a physical journey, it was an abdication of centuries of aloofness. This time, he did not go as a wrathful spectre in the night. He went in the pale, watery light of dawn, walking beside Rose, a silent, imposing shadow at her side. Lily, refusing to be left behind, trotted between them, her hand held alternately in each of theirs. The sight of the three of them, the ancient, silver-eyed king, the vibrant, determined healer, and the small, dark-haired child walking into the blighted heart of the city was a thing of myth, a scene no one would have dared to imagine. The reaction was immediate and profound. Where before the people had scattered in fear, now they watched, their faces a mixture of terror and bewildered hope. They saw their healer, Rose, return to them, and at her side, the very source of their fear, the king himself. But he was not looking at them with disdain or judgment. He was looking at where Rose looked, listening to what she said. He was, for all intents and purposes, her shadow, her enforcer, her silent, terrifying benefactor. Rose led him to the heart of the misery, to a makeshift infirmary she had been running out of a derelict public bathhouse. It was a place of damp stone, flickering lamps, and the quiet, desperate sounds of suffering. The sick lay on thin pallets, their bodies racked with the kind of poverty-born illnesses the upper city had not seen in generations. Rose moved among them without hesitation, her presence a balm. She knelt by a child with a fever, her hand cool on his brow. She spoke in low, comforting tones to an old man whose cough rattled his entire frame. She was in her element, a beacon of compassion in a sea of despair. Dimitri stood in the doorway, a creature of pristine darkness in a world of grime and pain. This was the sickness Rose had spoken of. Not just the fevers and the infections, but the systemic decay born of his own indifference. For the first time, he saw it not as an abstract failure of governance, but as a collection of individual, human tragedies. He saw the hollow eyes of a young mother watching her baby struggle for breath. He saw the gnarled, useless hands of a stonemason, his livelihood lost to an untreated injury. Each one was a silent accusation. He did not know what to do. His skills were in death and dominion, not in life and healing. He felt useless, an antiquated weapon in a place that needed builders. He watched Rose work, her movements economical and sure. She ran out of clean bandages and tore a strip from her own petticoat without a second thought. She had little medicine, relying on herbal poultices and the fierce, stubborn force of her own will. Lily, holding Sir Reginald, sat quietly on a crate in the corner, her small face solemn. She was used to this world, Dimitri realized with a pang of something he couldn't name. This was her normal. A child should not be so familiar with the geography of suffering. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long, sorrowful shadows through the grime-caked windows of the bathhouse, Rose came to him. She was exhausted, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, but her eyes were bright with purpose. "I need things," she said, not as a request, but as a demand. "Clean water. Barrels of it. I need linen for bandages, not rags. I need soap. I need food, broth, bread, anything. And I need firewood. The damp in this place is killing as many as the fever." It was a list of the most basic necessities of life, things he had in such abundance at the castle that he never gave them a moment's thought. He had storerooms filled with linen that had not been touched in a century. Kitchens that could feed 1,000. Aqueducts that brought fresh mountain water directly to his fountains. He nodded once, the gesture sharp and decisive. He turned and left the bathhouse. Within the hour, the first of the royal supply carts rumbled into the Narrows, laden with everything she had asked for and more. The guards driving them were pale and nervous, their eyes wide at the squalor, but they followed their king's orders without question. This became their new routine. Every day, Rose would work in the infirmary, and Dimitri would provide. He became a conduit, funneling the hoarded, stagnant wealth of his court down into the starved streets of the Undercroft. He had the bathhouse repaired, its ancient pipes cleared until hot, steaming water flowed for the first time in centuries. He had a proper clinic built, its stone clean and its windows letting in the light. He did not do it with decrees. He was there, overseeing the work, his silent presence more motivating than any foreman's shout. The people of the Narrows began to see him differently. The fear remained, but it was now mingled with a grudging respect. He was not one of them, could never be one of them, but he was for them. Because Rose was for them, and the king, it seemed, was for Rose. They began to work together, a partnership forged in the crucible of shared purpose. In the evenings, they would sit in the new clinic, the air smelling of antiseptic herbs instead of decay, and she would tell him what she had seen that day, the small victories and the heartbreaking losses. He would listen, his silver eyes intent, absorbing the realities of his kingdom for the first time. He learned their names. Not just Rose and Lily, but Ilara, the young mother whose baby had survived the fever. And Finn, the old stonemason, for whom Dimitri commissioned a set of specially designed tools that allowed him to work again. He learned the complex tapestry of their lives, the feuds and friendships, the hopes and fears. He was no longer ruling a map, he was presiding over a living, breathing city. One night, as a cold rain lashed against the windows of the clinic, they sat in silence, the day's work done. Lily was asleep on a cot in the back room, her breathing soft and even. The only sounds were the rain and the crackle of a small fire in the hearth. "You're good at this," Rose said softly, breaking the quiet. "At building things. At making things happen." "I am good at logistics," he corrected, his gaze on the fire. "It is a simple matter of resource allocation." She smiled, a small, tired curve of her lips. "You can call it whatever you want. I call it ruling. The kind that matters." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Why did you stop? All those years ago. Why did you let it all fall apart?" It was the question he had been dreading, the one that scraped at the edges of the grief he had buried so deep he'd forgotten its name. The library at the castle was his sanctuary because it was silent, but here, with her, the silence was expectant. It demanded an answer. He looked away from the fire, his gaze turning to the rain-streaked window. "I lost someone," he said, the words feeling like stones in his throat. "A long time ago. My wife. My son," he said the words plainly, without inflection, stripping them of the agony they still held, deep in the frozen core of him. "They were mortal. I was not. I watched them grow old and die, as I remained unchanged. After that, the world seemed to lose its color. Its purpose. Ruling, building, tending to the fleeting lives of mortals, it all felt like a cruel joke, a pointless exercise in repeating my own loss over and over again." He fell silent, the weight of the admission hanging in the air. He had not spoken of them to another soul in over 700 years. Rose did not offer platitudes or empty comforts. She simply listened, her green eyes filled with a profound, aching empathy. After a long moment, she reached out, her warm hand covering his, which rested, cold and still, on the table between them. It was not a romantic gesture, not yet. It was a simple, profound act of human connection. An anchor. "Grief is not a tomb you must lie in forever, Dimitri," she whispered. "It can be a garden you learn to tend again." He looked down at her hand on his. Her skin was warm, calloused from her work, alive. And under her touch, for the first time, he felt the faintest stirring of warmth in his own. He did not pull away. He simply sat there, with the rain and the fire and the quiet, compassionate presence of this woman, and allowed himself to feel the first, painful, beautiful thaw. The quiet moments of connection, like the one in the rain-lashed clinic, began to accumulate, each one a stone laid in the foundation of something new and terrifyingly fragile. The work in the Narrows continued, a shared project that bound Dimitri and Rose together in a rhythm of purpose. The clinic thrived, becoming a center of the community. The people no longer starved. The streets were cleaner, safer. It was not a paradise, but it was no longer a hell. It was a place with a future. And in building a future for his people, Dimitri found himself, impossibly, beginning to imagine one for himself. His life, once a vast, featureless expanse of time, now had texture. It was marked by the small, significant events of their days. The morning light slanting through the windows of the clinic. The satisfaction of seeing a new well dug, providing clean water to a whole district. The sound of Lily's laughter as she chased butterflies in the newly planted castle gardens. These were mortal moments, fleeting and precious, and they were beginning to fill the endless emptiness of his immortality. He spent less time in the castle library and more time in the world. He walked the city, not as a remote monarch, but as a known presence. He still inspired awe and a healthy dose of fear, but it was different now. He was their king not just by birthright, but by action. He listened to the grievances of merchants, mediated disputes between guilds, and began the slow, arduous process of untangling the knot of corruption and neglect that had defined his long reign of indifference. He was, as Rose had said, learning to rule again. Their late-night conversations became a ritual. After Lily was asleep, they would talk, sometimes in the clinic, sometimes in the castle library, which no longer felt like a tomb to him. It was here, surrounded by the weight of history, that he felt he could finally begin to unburden himself of his own. He told her of his past, not as a king, but as a man. He spoke of his mortal life, of the woman he had loved, of the son he had adored. He spoke of the crushing guilt of his own survival, the endless, lonely years of watching everything he cared for turn to dust. Rose listened, her presence a quiet, unwavering anchor in the stormy sea of his memory. She did not judge him for his withdrawal, for the centuries of neglect. She saw only the profound pain that had caused it. "You didn't choose to be what you are, Dimitri," she told him one night, her voice gentle as she traced the rim of a teacup. "But you are choosing who you will be now. That is all that matters." Her compassion was a revelation. He had expected condemnation for his failures, but she offered only understanding. He began to see her not just as a partner in his work, but as the only person in his long existence who saw him whole, the monster, the king, the grieving man, and was not afraid. He started to notice things about her. The way a stray curl of dark hair always escaped her braid. The fierce concentration in her eyes when she was grinding herbs. The rare, full-throated laugh that would escape her when Lily did something particularly charming. He found himself hoarding these small observations like treasures. The ache in his chest, the one that had started with Lily's plea, had transformed. It was no longer a phantom pain, but a living, breathing thing. It was a longing so deep and so powerful it terrified him. He wanted to close the small distance that always remained between them. He wanted to touch her without the pretense of work or comfort. He wanted to see her smile and know that he was the reason for it. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly consuming feeling. He was falling in love, and the sensation was so overwhelming it felt like he was being brought back to life, one painful, gasping breath at a time. One evening, they were in the castle's vast, domed conservatory, a place of glass and wrought iron that housed exotic plants from every corner of the world. It had been one of his first wife's favorite places, and he had not set foot in it for 700 years. But Rose had rediscovered it, and under her care, the dusty, dying plants had begun to thrive again. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Lily had fallen asleep on a cushioned bench, her head pillowed on Sir Reginald. The moonlight streamed through the glass ceiling, silvering the leaves and casting intricate shadows on the floor. It was a place of profound peace. "It's beautiful in here," Rose said, her voice a soft murmur. She was standing by a fountain, trailing her fingers in the cool water. "It was my wife's," he said, the words coming out more easily than they once would have. "She loved this place. She said it was like holding the whole world in your hands." Rose turned to him, her expression gentle. "It must be hard. To live with so many ghosts." "They were all I had," he confessed. For a very long time he took a step closer to her, the scent of jasmine and damp earth enveloping him. "Until you." The air between them grew thick, charged with all the things they had left unsaid for months. Her breath hitched, a tiny, audible sound in the quiet room. Her green eyes, luminous in the moonlight, were wide and searching. "Dimitri," she whispered, his name both a question and a plea. He stopped just before her, his body humming with a tension that was both exquisite and agonizing. He could see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the same fear and longing that was warring inside him. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. He gently brushed the stray curl of hair from her cheek, his cold fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against the impossible warmth of her skin. The contact was electric, a jolt that went straight to the frozen core of him. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible, but it was everything. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, a silent surrender. In that instant, he saw his own future reflected in her face. A future that was not an endless, grey expanse of survival, but a life filled with warmth and purpose, and her. But the moment was broken by a small, sleepy sound. Lily stirred on the bench, murmuring in her sleep and clutching Sir Reginald tighter. The spell was shattered. Rose took a step back, her cheeks flushed, her eyes avoiding his. The intimacy of the moment retreated, leaving a raw, exposed vulnerability in its wake. "It's late," she said, her voice strained. "I should get her to bed." Dimitri could only nod, his throat tight. He watched as she gently scooped her sleeping daughter into her arms and left the conservatory, leaving him alone with the moonlight, the ghosts, and the terrifying, wonderful, undeniable truth of his own heart. He loved her. And he had no idea what to do with a heart that had, after 800 years, decided to start beating again. The transformation of the kingdom did not go unnoticed by the old guard. For centuries, Dimitri's neglect had been a boon to the more predatory members of his court, a collection of ancient, powerful vampires who had grown fat and complacent on the rot they secretly fostered. They viewed the mortal population as little more than cattle and the kingdom as their private hunting ground. Rose's influence over the king, and the subsequent reforms, were a direct threat to their comfortable, parasitic existence. Whispers slithered through the cold, shadowed halls of the citadel, venomous and sharp. They spoke of the mortal healer, the woman who had bewitched their king and turned his attention to the grimy affairs of sheep when he should have been tending to the needs of the wolves. At the head of this descent was Lord Valerus, a vampire of Dimitri's own making, turned in a decadent, long-forgotten age. Valerus was a creature of refined cruelty, his civility a thin veneer over a core of pure, selfish ambition. He saw Rose not just as an inconvenience, but as an intolerable insult. The idea that a mortal, a healer no less, could hold more sway with the king than he and his ancient brethren was a disruption to the very order of their world. Dimitri was not blind to the resentment simmering in his court. He saw the cold, contemptuous glances Valerus cast at Rose, the way the other courtiers would fall silent when she entered a room. He had dismissed it as the petty jealousy of stagnant minds, confident in his own absolute power to quell any open dissent. It was a miscalculation born of centuries of unchallenged authority. He had forgotten how desperate cornered animals could be. The attack came on a day that was deceptively beautiful. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and a warm breeze rustled the leaves in the castle gardens. Rose and Lily were in the central courtyard, a place of fountains and meticulously sculpted hedges that Rose had slowly been coaxing back to life. Lily was chasing a vibrant blue butterfly, her laughter echoing off the ancient stones, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. Rose was watching her, a fond smile on her face, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Lord Valerus. He was flanked by two other vampires of his faction, their faces impassive masks. Valerus himself was smiling, a tight, predatory curl of his lips that did not reach his cold, dark eyes. "Mistress Rose," he said, his voice a silken purr. "Enjoying the fruits of our king's generosity?" Rose's smile faded. She rose slowly to her feet, her body instinctively positioning itself between Valerus and her daughter. "Lord Valerus," she acknowledged, her tone cool and steady. "Is there something you need?" "Oh, nothing of consequence," Valerus said, taking a step closer. "I merely came to offer some friendly advice. You are playing a dangerous game, little healer. You have filled our king's head with foolish notions of charity and mortal worth. But kings, like seasons, can change. And when his fascination with you fades, you will be left with nothing but the enmity of those who have a much, much longer memory. Is that a threat?" Rose asked, her chin lifting in defiance. Valerus laughed, a short, ugly sound. "It is a statement of fact. You do not belong here. This world of ours will chew up and spit out little sparks of life like you." It always has. He took another step, his eyes flicking past her to where Lily had stopped, her laughter silenced, her eyes wide with fear as she watched the confrontation. Such a pretty child. It would be a shame if her life were to be cut short by her mother's ambition. The thinly veiled threat was a match to a fuse. The protective instinct in Rose flared into a cold, hard rage. "If you ever speak of my daughter again," she said, her voice low and shaking with fury, "I will find a way to make you regret it, I swear on my life." Valerus's smile widened. Brave words. He raised a hand, and before Rose could react, one of the other vampires moved with blinding speed, seizing Lily. The child let out a terrified scream as she was lifted from the ground, her small legs kicking uselessly. "Mama!" At the sound of Lily's cry, something primal and ferocious broke loose in Rose. She launched herself at the vampire holding her daughter, but Valerus intercepted her, his grip on her arm like a band of iron. Now, healer," he sneered. "Let us not be hasty." It was at that precise moment that Dimitri arrived. He had been on his way to meet them, drawn by the sound of Lily's laughter. But the sound that reached him now was her scream, a shard of pure terror that lanced straight into his soul. He moved through the archway into the courtyard, and the scene before him burned itself into his vision. Valerus holding Rose, his sneering face close to hers, another vampire holding a struggling, weeping Lily, a third standing guard. The world went silent. The sound of the fountains, the rustle of the leaves, the very air itself seemed to freeze. For 800 years, Dimitri had cultivated a cold, detached control over his own power. He had treated his immense strength and speed as tools, to be used with precision and without emotion. All of that shattered in a single, incandescent moment of pure, protective fury. His silver eyes, normally the color of calm moonlight, blazed with a white, terrifying light. A low growl, a sound more animal than man, tore from his throat. It was not the voice of a king, it was the roar of a predator whose mate and child were threatened. Valerus and his cohorts froze, their ancient, undead hearts knowing, on a primal level, that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They had not just threatened a mortal, they had laid hands on what was his. Dimitri did not speak. He did not issue a command or a warning. He simply acted. He crossed the 50 feet of courtyard in a span of time too short to be measured. He was a blur of black, a spectre of absolute vengeance. His first target was the vampire holding Lily. The creature's eyes widened in shock as Dimitri's hand closed around his throat, lifting him clear off the ground. There was no struggle. There was only the sound of snapping bone, sharp and final as a thunderclap, and the body fell to the ground, inert. Dimitri caught Lily before she hit the stone, his movements impossibly fluid. He held her for a barest fraction of a second, his blazing eyes scanning her for any injury, before setting her gently behind him. "Rose, get back," he commanded, his voice a low, guttural snarl he didn't recognize as his own. Valerus, his face a mask of shock and dawning terror, shoved Rose away from him and drew a decorative, but sharp, dress sword. "You would choose these mortals over your own kind," he spat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "They are more my kind than you have ever been," Dimitri snarled back. The third vampire, seeing his companion dispatched so effortlessly, made a desperate lunge. Dimitri didn't even turn his full attention to him. He moved with a brutal economy, a sidestep and a backhanded blow that caved in the vampire's chest with a sickening, wet crunch. The creature flew backward, hitting the stone wall of the fountain and sliding down into the water, turning it a murky, swirling black. Now, only Valerus was left. He stood alone, his sword held in a trembling hand, facing the full, unrestrained fury of his king. The terror in Valerus's eyes was absolute. He had known Dimitri as a cold, dispassionate ruler. He had never seen this. This was not a king. This was a god of death, woken from a long slumber. Dimitri walked toward him, his steps slow and deliberate, each one a hammer blow of judgment. He made no move to draw a weapon. He didn't need one. "You put your hands on her," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper that carried across the courtyard. "You threatened a child. In my home." Valerus, in a final act of suicidal defiance, lunged forward, thrusting his sword at Dimitri's heart. Dimitri didn't even bother to dodge. He caught the blade in his bare hand, the razor-sharp steel grating against his inhumanly dense flesh but failing to draw blood. With a simple twist of his wrist, he snapped the blade in two. He tossed the broken hilt aside, its clatter on the flagstones the only sound in the frozen courtyard. Then he took Valerus by the throat. He lifted him until his feet dangled uselessly above the ground, the ancient vampire choking and clawing at the unbreakable grip. Dimitri stared into his eyes, letting him feel the full, terrifying weight of his mistake. "You reminded me of something, Valerus," Dimitri whispered, his voice laced with a chilling calm that was far more terrible than his rage. "Something I had forgotten. That there are things in this world worth protecting. And that there are things that must be purged." He did not grant Valerus a quick death. The end was a silent, brutal affair of overwhelming strength, an unmaking that left nothing behind but a pile of fine, grey dust that the gentle breeze began to scatter across the sun-drenched stones. The violence was over as quickly as it had begun. The courtyard was silent again, save for the gentle splashing of the fountain, its water now tinged with black. Dimitri stood in the center of it all, his chest heaving, not from exertion, but from the sheer, overwhelming force of the emotions coursing through him. The rage was already receding, replaced by a cold, bone-deep terror. He turned, his wild, silver eyes finding Rose. She was standing where Valerus had shoved her, her hand over her mouth, her green eyes wide with shock. Behind him, he heard a small, hiccuping sob. "Lily." He knelt, turning to the child. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. Lily just shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his shoulder, her small body trembling. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her with a gentleness that was a stark contrast to the devastation he had just wrought. He held her small, warm, living body against his own and felt the terror sharpen. The thought of losing her, of losing Rose, was a physical agony, a wound far deeper than any blade could inflict. It was in that moment, holding a weeping child amidst the dust of his enemies, that the last wall of ice around his heart did not just crack, but vaporized. He loved them. He loved them with a ferocity that was primal and absolute, a love that was inextricably bound to this terrifying, magnificent capacity for violence. He was a monster, yes. But he was their monster. He looked up at Rose over Lily's trembling shoulders. Her expression was complex, awe, fear, but overwhelmingly, a dawning, fierce understanding. She walked toward him, her steps slow but sure, and knelt in front of him. She reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek. Her touch was not questioning or fearful. It was acclaiming. "Dimitri," she whispered. He could not speak. He could only look at her, his silver eyes raw with an emotion he had thought himself incapable of for 800 years. He was terrified of what she saw, the killer, the beast unleashed. But her gaze was steady, her touch was firm. She saw it all, and she was not turning away. In her eyes, he did not see a monster. He saw a protector. He saw the man who had answered her daughter's plea. He saw the man she was beginning, impossibly, to love in return. The terror in his soul began to recede, replaced by a wave of relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He was seen. He was known. And he was not alone. The aftermath of the courtyard incident settled over the castle like a profound, transformative silence. The descent in Dimitri's court vanished overnight, replaced by a new and palpable fear, but it was a fear tempered with a dawning respect. The king was no longer a dispassionate abstraction, he was a terrifyingly present force, his motivations now clear and absolute. To threaten Rose or Lily was to invite utter annihilation. The lines had been drawn, and the safety of the healer and her child was now the most sacred law in the land. But for Dimitri, the true aftermath was internal. The violent, protective fury had burned away the last vestiges of his apathy, leaving him raw and exposed. He could no longer hide behind the pretense of cold detachment. His feelings for Rose and Lily were not a quiet, budding warmth, but a raging, all-consuming fire in the center of his being. He had been forced to confront the depth of his own love through the terrifying prospect of their loss, and the knowledge had irrevocably changed him. That evening, he found Rose in her chambers. Lily was asleep in the adjoining room, the door left slightly ajar. Rose was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens, the scene of the day's violence now serene and peaceful under the silver light. She did not seem surprised to see him when he entered. She simply turned from the window, her expression calm and waiting. She knew this conversation was inevitable. Dimitri stopped in the center of the room, the space between them feeling like a vast, uncharted territory. For a man who had commanded armies and ruled for nearly a millennium, he felt utterly powerless, stripped of all his authority and artifice. He was just a man or a creature like one, standing before a woman, his heart laid bare. "What you saw today," he began, his voice rough, uncertain. "That is what I am. A monster." Rose shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "No," she said softly. "Today, I saw what you are for." There's a difference. She took a step toward him. "I have seen monsters, Dimitri. They are the men who prey on the weak for sport or profit. They are the ones who hurt children to make a point. What I saw today was a protector. A terrifying, deadly, and magnificent protector." Her words were a balm on a wound he hadn't known was festering. He had been so afraid that his true nature, his capacity for brutal violence, would drive her away. But she, with her healer's insight, had looked past the act and seen the intent. She had seen the love that fueled the rage. "When I saw him holding her," Dimitri confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper, the memory still raw. "When I thought he might. I felt something break inside me. Something that has been frozen for centuries. And I was terrified. Not of them. Of what I would lose if they harmed you." He took a hesitant step closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "I have spent 800 years building walls around myself, Rose. To keep the world out, to keep the pain of loss at bay. And in a few short months, you and your daughter have torn them all down as if they were nothing but dust. I am undone. Is that such a bad thing?" she asked, her green eyes searching his. "It is terrifying," he admitted. I have not felt this for anyone since before the world you know was even born. I do not know how to be this person. This man who feels he finally met her gaze, his own silver eyes pleading, vulnerable. I love you, Rose. I love you with a depth that terrifies me. And I love your daughter as if she were my own. I cannot go back to the cold. I cannot go back to the silence. But I do not know how to go forward. The confession hung in the air between them, pure and absolute. It was not a flowery declaration, but a raw statement of fact, a bearing of his soul. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of overwhelming relief and a joy so profound it was painful. She closed the remaining distance between them in 2 quick steps, her hands coming up to cup his face. Her touch was firm, grounding. You don't have to know how, Dimitri, she whispered, her thumbs gently stroking his cheekbones. We will learn together. Her voice broke on a sob. I love you, too. I think I have from the moment I saw you standing in that filthy room, a terrifying avenging angel come to answer my daughter's prayer. I was afraid of it. I was afraid of you. But I'm not afraid anymore. And then, she rose on her toes and she kissed him. It was not a tentative, exploratory kiss. It was a kiss of profound certainty, a sealing of a pact that had been forged in darkness and fear, and was now being claimed in light and love. His cold lips met her warm ones, and the contact was a cataclysm. For him, it was the breaking of an age-old fast, a flood of life and sensation into a place that had been barren for centuries. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him, his entire being suffused with a sense of homecoming he had thought he would never know again. This was not a fleeting, mortal love to be cherished and then mourned. This was something else. Something that felt as eternal as he was. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. The silence in the room was no longer empty, it was full, rich with shared emotion and unspoken promises. I cannot offer you a normal life, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I cannot give you children of your own blood, or grow old with you. I can only offer you my protection, my loyalty, and all the days of my unending life. He pulled back slightly, his silver eyes opening to look into hers. Marry me, Rose. Be my wife. Be my queen. Let Lily be my daughter. Let us build this new world together. It was not a king's proposal, a strategic alliance or a matter of state. It was the simple, desperate plea of a man who had found his reason to exist. Rose's tears were flowing freely now, but she was smiling, a brilliant, beautiful smile that lit up her entire face. Yes, she breathed, the word a quiet promise that echoed with the weight of centuries. Yes, Dimitri. Of course, yes. He slid his arms around her again, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. And to him, she was. She and the small, sleeping child in the next room. They were his heart, his purpose, his salvation. A brave child's impossible courage and a compassionate healer's unyielding love had walked into his frozen tomb and led him back into the sun. The wedding was not a grand state affair. There was no procession of foreign dignitaries, no ostentatious display of wealth for a populace that was only just beginning to recover. Instead, it was an intimate ceremony held in the conservatory, the place where their love had first dared to show itself. The glass dome arched above them like a private sky, and the air was sweet with the scent of jasmine and Rose's resurrected flowers. The only guests were the people who mattered. The old stonemason, Finn, stood as a witness for Rose, his gnarled hands clasped before him, his face etched with a quiet, paternal pride. A handful of other residents from the Narrows, those whose lives Rose had saved and Dimitri had helped rebuild, sat on simple wooden benches, their presence a testament to the new bridge between the citadel and the city. Lily, of course, was the heart of the entire affair. She wore a simple white dress and a crown of wildflowers she had woven herself, and she took her role as ring-bearer with a solemnity that was both adorable and profound. She carried a small silk pillow, upon which rested 2 simple bands of silver, and as she walked the short aisle, she held the hand of Sir Reginald, ensuring her oldest friend was also a part of this new beginning. Rose was radiant. She wore a simple dress of dark green velvet that matched her eyes, her hair woven with the same wildflowers as Lily's crown. She was not a queen in jewels and silk, but a queen of substance and strength, her beauty emanating from the fierce, compassionate spirit within. As she walked toward him, her eyes locked on his, Dimitri felt a sense of peace settle over him, a rightness so absolute it felt like the final, perfect alignment of stars that had been wandering for an eternity. He, too, had eschewed the heavy robes of state. He wore a simple, well-tailored coat of black wool, the severity of it a contrast to the life blooming all around them. But the coldness was gone from his silver eyes. Today, they reflected the light, shining with a warmth and tenderness that no one had ever seen in them before. When Rose reached him, he took her hands in his. They were warm and capable, the hands of a healer, a mother, a queen. Lily stood between them, looking up at their joined hands with a wide, happy smile. The vows they exchanged were not the ancient, prescribed words of the state, but their own. He spoke of the long, cold darkness, and how she had been the dawn he no longer believed would ever come. He promised to honor her strength, to protect her fire, and to spend the rest of his eternal life being a man worthy of her love. She spoke of seeing past the fearsome king to the lonely, grieving man beneath. She promised to be his anchor, his partner, and to help him tend the garden of his heart, just as they were tending the garden of their kingdom. When they exchanged the rings, Lily held the pillow up to them. Dimitri slipped the silver band onto Rose's finger, his cold hand steady. Then, Rose took the other ring and slid it onto his. The touch of the cool metal on his skin was a brand, a mark of a new identity. He was no longer just Dimitri the king, the ancient, lonely creature of the night. He was Dimitri, husband to Rose, father to Lily. He was part of a family. He knelt down, so he was eye to eye with Lily. "And I make a promise to you, too, Lily," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I will always protect you. I will always be there for you. I will be the best father I know how to be." Lily's face broke into a radiant grin. She threw her arms around his neck, and he hugged her tightly, the small, warm weight of her a confirmation of everything that was now real and true in his life. He rose, with Lily still clinging to him, and with his other arm, he drew Rose close, until the three of them were a single, tight-knit unit. A strange, impossible, and utterly perfect family. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow through the conservatory glass, the three of them stood on the high parapet where this story had begun. The city of Viridia spread out below them, no longer a distant, meaningless abstraction to Dimitri, but a living, breathing entity that was his and Rose's shared responsibility. The lights coming on in the Narrows were no longer the guttering flames of despair, but the steady glow of a community being reborn. Rose leaned her head against his shoulder, and Lily stood between them, holding both of their hands. The wind was still sharp, but Dimitri no longer felt the cold. He was filled with a warmth that came from within, a steady, burning flame that he knew would never be extinguished as long as these two were by his side. He looked down at the woman who had challenged him, healed him, and loved him back to life. He looked at the child whose simple, brave plea had cracked open a heart frozen for 800 years. He had thought himself beyond salvation, a relic doomed to a passionless eternity. But salvation had come, not in a grand battle or a divine intervention, but in the form of a lost little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit, and a fierce, gentle woman who saw the man inside the monster. He had found his purpose not in ruling, but in loving. And as he held his new family close, watching the twilight embrace their healing kingdom, Dimitri, the once frozen king, was finally, truly, home.